Hi everyone, so today we're going to talk about China and China's interactions with the West. So this chapter 26 and then chapter 27 are having us look at how different parts of the world responded to Western industrialization and imperialism. So I believe you already did a reading from AMSCO about the Ottomans and the Arabs and how they responded. If you didn't do that, then maybe you're going to do it tomorrow. I don't totally remember. But this is going to tell us about how China responded to those same things. So as the West is industrializing and becoming more imperialist, like we know they've taken over all of Africa by this point, how do these other countries respond as they come into contact with Europeans and Americans? So the Qing dynasty by this point in the 1800s already had some issues, and you definitely don't need to write down all of these. You could pick a few examples. These are also going to be repeated in your homework, and we're going to do the Autopsy of the Empire project where you can review some of these things. But the point is that the Qing dynasty was already struggling in a lot of ways, even before they started having all these issues with Europeans that we're going to talk about. So there was an increasing gap between rich and poor. Tenant farmers were losing their land. So tenant farmers are people that rent their land, they don't own it. And so due to taxation and fees, a lot of these tenant farmers were going into debt and not even being able to pay the rent on their land. There was a drop in military training. Infrastructure was deteriorating. So we know throughout history, one of the Chinese government's major responsibilities was to maintain the infrastructure, especially irrigation infrastructure. And so when they often started to have money problems, dynasties would kind of let that go, and that would cause even more problems if your agriculture isn't doing well and you're already struggling. Corruption of the civil service exam system we've talked about before as well. So people would, say, bribe other people to take the exam for them. And so the people who ended up being scholar bureaucrats weren't always the people who were best suited to those jobs. Increased government spending on private projects. So the bureaucrats and the top government officials were spending money on parks and palaces and things like that for themselves. And then flooding due to neglect of irrigation was a problem, which goes back to not maintaining the infrastructure and lots of farmland lost. So you can write down a couple of those examples, but again, the key is that the Qing dynasty was already having some issues as the Europeans come in and create more problems for them. So the first major event between Europeans and Chinese in the 19th century is the Opium Wars. So to understand how this came about, we need to think about China, even in the time period previously, 1450 to 1750, and how they responded when Europeans first showed up in Asia in large numbers. So remember, the Chinese had been self-sufficient for a long time. We talked about that like even way back in the Han Dynasty, how they viewed themselves as the center of the world and as superior to other civilizations. And so when they started when Europeans came to trade in the 1500s and 1600s, the Chinese didn't really feel like they had anything to gain from it because the Europeans wanted Chinese goods like silk and other luxury products, and the Chinese didn't really feel like they needed to trade with the Europeans, and that's why they even required the Europeans to pay in silver. And so this created an unfavorable balance of trade for countries like Britain. And we've talked about why that's bad. That means that you're importing more than you're exporting. So the British have lots of silver flowing to China to pay for all these luxury products, and the Chinese aren't really buying anything from them. And so they don't like that. It goes against the theory of mercantilism, and they want to rectify that. And so what the British began doing is they found a product that the Chinese would buy, which was opium. So opium, they were growing in their colonies, in their British colonies in India and the Middle East, and they started selling that in China, and lots and lots of people became addicted. So if you even pay attention to the news today and hear about things like the opioid epidemic, drugs like heroin and things like that come from opioids. So it's a very addictive substance. And this caught on in China and gained popularity as a recreational drug. And so that's what these photographs show, people in opium dens throughout China. By 1835, at least 12 million Chinese were addicted to opium. And just think about for a minute the toll that that would take on your society if people who previously were contributing members of society and worked and had jobs now are addicted to drugs and spending their time doing that instead. It really caused a lot of harm to families, to the economy, and all kinds of things like that. So because of this problem, the Chinese appealed to the British and asked them to stop selling opium, but the British refused because they were making a lot of money off of it. And so the Qing government started seizing opium that was stored in China. So like when the British would come to China, they would have big warehouses where they would unload their ships onto Chinese territory. And so the Chinese started seizing those buildings and destroying the opium that they found inside. And so as a result, the British attacked China as a result of this destruction of their trade goods. And this led to a series of wars called the Opium Wars. So you have two sources to read on your notes here. The first one is a letter from the Chinese to Queen Victoria. Queen Victoria was the monarch of Britain at the time of the Opium Wars. And then the second one, you have part of the Treaty of Nanjing. This was the peace treaty that settled the Opium Wars. So go ahead and read those and answer the questions, and then you can pause the video and discuss the questions as a class. So the Chinese were defeated in the Opium Wars by the British, and that's probably a result of the fact that the British at the time had more advanced firearm weapons. And so the Chinese were forced to sign the Treaty of Nanjing, which you just read part of it. And here's just a little review of some of the major things that resulted from that treaty. So the British gained the territory of Hong Kong, which was a really important trade city. And the British actually held Hong Kong as a colony until, I believe, 1997. They were forced to open 5 more ports to British trade. So if you remember before this, the Chinese had decided to limit foreign trade, especially of Europeans, into China, and they only allowed them to trade at selected ports like Macau. Now, they had to open up much more widely to European trade, and so with that, we're going to have a lot more European influence coming into China. They increased privileges for Chinese missionaries. So just like in Japan, the Chinese had limited the actions of the Jesuits and not allowed them free reign over their country. And now they have to open up more to that. And then Westerners were given extraterritorial rights. Extraterritorial rights mean that within their own little trading zones within China, the Europeans were exempt from any kind of punishment for breaking any Chinese laws or regulations. So it really put them above the law in China and granted them a lot of special privileges that even the Chinese people didn't have themselves. Another side effect of all of this trade and industrialization and imperialism during this time is the formation of multinational corporations. And an example of that is the HBSC, which is the Hong Kong and Shanghai Banking Corporation, which you can tell from the picture is still around today. This was founded by the British in Hong Kong in 1865. And the questions here are, how does this result from the Industrial Revolution, and how does this result from imperialism? So we learned back in chapter 23 that the West developed all new kinds of financial instruments like stock markets and corporations in order to deal with the expanded business of the Industrial Revolution. And this is just an extension of that. So when the British arrived in Hong Kong and gained that as a colony, they needed a way to better control their money, all this money that's going in and out as a result of trade. And so large banking corporations like this one were founded. All right, so now we're in the middle of the 1800s in China. The Opium Wars have occurred. China has been forced to sign this unfavorable treaty that granted more privileges to foreigners and allowed more foreign trade and influence to come in. And so this leads to a series of rebellions in China because the people of China aren't necessarily happy that these arrangements have been made with foreigners. At the same time, we know that the Qing is already dealing with economic and social issues, and so that also leads to rebellion. So some long-term causes of the Taiping Rebellion would be those same challenges that the Qing government was dealing with. So there's increased population due to New World foods coming in, but at the same time, remember, the government is neglecting the irrigation and infrastructure, and so flooding and famine result. There's not enough food production. There's also corruption in the exam system. And this is a photograph of the little huts where the examination students would stay for a period of about 3 days to take their examinations. And we talked about, and it's in your reading, it actually describes in a lot of detail about how they dealt with cheaters and different things like that in the examination system. But basically, people were getting in who were not qualified to be bureaucrats. So you could list just a couple examples of those issues as long-term causes of the Taiping Rebellion. So like these are issues that people recognize that are building over time and causing people to be dissatisfied with the government. So the immediate cause of the Taiping Rebellion was the leadership of a peasant. And it describes him more in your chapter, but basically this was a guy who was a peasant. He was uneducated and illiterate, and he probably was mentally ill. And he went around preaching the idea that he was sent directly from God. He said he was the son of Jesus. So this shows that even though China had tried to restrict Christian influence within its country, there still was Christian influence coming in, the fact that he identified himself with Jesus, but that people didn't really fully understand the Christian religion because obviously this doesn't really mesh fully with that. But the reason people really probably attached themselves to him is that he promoted the idea that one day all Chinese would share in China's great wealth. So he said, like, if he takes over the government, he's going to get rid of the social class distinctions, the poor people who are suffering right now and don't have enough food due to the famines, like all of that is going to be taken care of. And so peasants identified with him, and he was able to organize an army of about 1 million people who were pretty successful in taking over territory in southern China. And you can see in the pink on the map are the areas that they controlled. They even captured the capital city of Nanjing. So initially, they were pretty successful in this rebellion. The Taiping Rebellion went on for the next 10 years, and the Qing government tried to stop it and was not fully successful. It wasn't until foreign governments like the British and the French sent their own troops into China to stop this rebellion that it was taken over. So why would they want to do that? The British and the French by this point are trading a lot in China. And so if there's this huge rebellion, it's going to interfere with their trade and possibly slow down their trade. And so they don't want that to happen. And so they have an interest in maintaining stability in China and kind of keeping things going the same as they have been so that they can continue to trade. The Taiping Rebellion had a lot of negative effects on China. And you have to remember, this is a war that went on for 10 years. So it resulted in a lot of destruction of farmland, which was one of the problems that they were protesting to begin with, is the fact that farming was deteriorating and they didn't have enough food. At least 20 million people died fighting and continued unrest. So although the Taiping Rebellion was put down by these foreign governments, none of those underlying issues that we talked about as long-term causes of the rebellion were actually settled. So the government didn't change any of those things or fix any of those issues, and so future rebellions popped up anyway. One of the people who was very influential in the Qing dynasty in the later part of the 19th century was Empress Cixi. And she ruled at a time when people in China were really differing about the direction that China should take. So some people felt like China was falling way behind the West, and so the only way they were going to survive is if they reformed and adopted Western technology and Western culture. And then there are other people that felt like China had been way too open to Western influence. And what they needed to do was return to being a closed society and return to their traditional culture. And so this woman, Empress Shishi, is a dowager empress. This means that her husband had been the emperor and he had died. And you can see she was a regent to her young son and then eventually her nephew. That means that they came to power when they were children. And so whenever that happens, when we have a monarch who comes to power when they're too young to actually rule on their own, they have a regent, which is someone who kind of rules in their name. So that's how she was able to exercise a lot of authority. And she backed what's called the self-strengthening movement, which is a reform movement in China, which we'll talk about on the next slide. So to understand the self-strengthening movement, I think it's really in the name. So this is the idea that China is going to strengthen itself from the inside and make reforms on its own terms. So they're going to change some things and adopt some Western technology, but they're not going to fully abandon their Chinese culture. And they're not going to, hopefully not going to wait for Westerners to just overrun them and take over. So some examples of things they did: they updated the education system. And we know when we've talked about the Industrial Revolution in the West, education becomes a really important part of that, because if you're going to have people working in new types of jobs, they need a better education. They're also going to send diplomats to other countries. So historically, China had been very closed off. They didn't really feel like they needed to interact with other countries, and now they're going to start doing that more and more. They also were going to adopt some Western technology, like Western weapons, the telegraph system, and railroads. But at the same time, they want to preserve Chinese values about the family and society. So think about the traditional Confucian values of China and filial piety and the importance of the family. The self-strengthening movement, the goal is to adopt some Western things and change China and modernize without losing what they felt like made them really Chinese, which is their traditional culture and values. Problems with the self-strengthening movement: in order to fund these things, like building railroads and laying telegraph wires, China ended up borrowing money from foreigners, so it became more indebted to some foreign governments. And also this led to an unfavorable balance of trade for China, which we know they had been really good at maintaining a favorable balance of trade for many hundreds of years. So the fact that China became more open to Western ideas continued to change it. And so many Western nations took advantage of Chinese weaknesses and forced China to sign unfavorable treaties. So they saw that the Qing dynasty was really struggling and came into China and forced them to sign treaties that gave away more and more privileges to foreigners. One of the things that was created out of these treaties are called spheres of influence. So spheres of influence are a region in which a foreign nation controlled trade and investment. So if you look at the map, for example, Britain is in orange. So in the orange areas on China, that's Britain's sphere of influence. And that means that within that area, Britain is the only country that can trade there. So if you want to, you can pause and discuss this question. Is this imperialism? So remember, in China, they are not ever fully colonized by any other country. So the British don't own that territory. It's still Chinese territory. But what kind of influence are they having there? So you can discuss that. This situation continued to harm Chinese industries because the Westerners are sending tons of manufactured products. And remember, manufactured products from Europe at this time are made in factories. They're mass produced. So they're much cheaper than products that the Chinese were producing, which would be things that were still made by hand in cottage industries. And so this put, just like we talked about in India, this put a lot of Chinese businesses out of business. Eventually, the United States became concerned about all of this because they saw Europeans coming more and more into China, and the United States didn't want China to be colonized. Now, that may sound like we were trying to be really nice to China, but I would say the United States was concerned that we would not be able to continue trading in China and did not want that to happen. And so the United States issued what's called the open door policy. And this was a policy that said China should remain like an open door. Like any foreign nation should be able to go in there and freely trade. And it should never be formally colonized or taken over by foreign governments. As the spheres of influence expanded and foreign trade continued to increase, there were a lot of people in China who wanted further reform. The Qing government, though, saw this as a threat to its traditional power, and the empress especially was known for resisting change. She actually had, after her son died, she became the regent for her young nephew and actually had him thrown in prison because he was somebody who was wanting more and more reform and change. And so I would say really the problem here is that the Qing government is kind of indecisive. Like they're not really taking strong action one way or another on how they're going to deal with this continued influx of foreigners. And another rebellion took place at the very end of the 19th century called the Boxer Rebellion. This was really caused by a backlash against the special privileges of foreigners. So think about the spheres of influence and those special areas of trade for foreigners. Also, we learned back in the Treaty of Nanjing that ended the Opium Wars that the foreigners were granted extraterritorial rights, which meant that they were exempt from a lot of Chinese laws while they were in China trading. And so all of those special privileges, the people saw that and were very resentful that the Chinese government had allowed those things to happen. So the Boxers were members of a secret organization in China, and they are called the Boxers because they practiced martial arts, and they came to develop their own spiritual beliefs where they believed that the practice of martial arts would give them special powers, and they would be somewhat immortal, like they would not be harmed by Western weapons, including bullets. And again, this is something that might sound kind of crazy to us, but we've talked about this before, how in times of great crisis, a lot of times people turn to religion or spiritual beliefs to give themselves hope in other situations that seem just impossible. So if you'd like to, you could pause the video and kind of talk about synthesis, or how can we compare this to other things we've studied in history. And I'll give you a hint, you definitely have learned examples of this when we studied imperialism in Africa. So go ahead and pause and talk about that for a minute if you'd like to. So the Boxers were upset by foreign takeover and especially disliked Christian missionaries. They really saw the spread of Christianity in China as undermining all of the traditional Chinese philosophy like Confucianism and Taoism, etc. And so they really targeted Christian missionaries as a symbol of the expanded influence of Westerners. So in the year 1900, the Boxers organized and went around China, and basically they sought out anyone who was Western, especially Christian missionaries, as well as Chinese who had converted to Christianity, and killed them. And so the Western countries saw this and were horrified and invaded China to stop the rebellion, which is what you see at the bottom there. They also forced the Chinese to pay an indemnity, which is like reparations. They have to pay for the loss of life to the Western countries. And so the Boxer Rebellion was another demonstration of how the Chinese people really disliked, in a lot of ways, this Western influence coming into their country. The lasting effects, nationalism increased after the Boxer Rebellion was stopped. So that just means people became even more strongly convinced that they needed to hold on to everything that made them specifically Chinese and get rid of any kind of Western influence. The government continued to attempt reforms, and they started kind of discussing the idea of a constitutional monarchy and changing the idea or the structure of the government, but the unrest continued. And the Qing were eventually overthrown in 1911 by a new party led by Sun Yat-sen. So the Qing dynasty is the last dynasty ever in China. It ended around 1911 due to a buildup of all of these different issues we've been talking about through this PowerPoint. And from that point on, a Republican government was established in China, at least for a little while. So, the last thing you see here is a political cartoon. This represents one of the specific terms that you learned in this PowerPoint. So go ahead and pause and talk about as a class what you think this represents. Hopefully you decided that this most clearly represents spheres of influence, because we see the Europeans in this case, dividing up China. And I'll go through who these people are in case you are not sure. So seated down at the bottom on the left, we have Queen Victoria, who represents Britain. In the middle there, we have the German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck. Next to him, we have Nicholas and Alexandra. They're the Russian monarchs. And then we also have the leader of Japan. And in the background, we have a Chinese person representing the Qing dynasty, trying to stop this Western takeover. So to conclude this, you're going to do an activity over the Qing dynasty where you look at Autopsy for an Empire, which we did way back in the beginning of the year. And I believe you have a separate PowerPoint with reminders of how to do this correctly, but I'll just go over a couple brief things. Remember, for the patient history, you need to talk about the Qing dynasty in the good times. Before it was suffering, what was it doing? What were its accomplishments? So you're going to have to go back and look at notes back to possibly chapter 22 about the Qing dynasty and what they were doing before they started to struggle. Then you're going to illustrate the problems of the Qing dynasty creatively. Make sure that you illustrate them and that you write a really good description. So you need a description of what the ailment is plus what it represents and why.